The Hells Angels biker watched the little girl brush dirt from a buried chest behind the barn, and the secret inside shook his past. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's incredible story. It was a bitterly cold autumn afternoon, the kind that made even the most seasoned bikers want to stay off the roads. Jake Reaper Morrison, a Hells Angels member with decades of experience, was riding his Harley-Davidson through the quiet countryside. His thoughts were as cold as the wind biting through his leather jacket. Life had been relentless, one bad decision after another, until everything in his past had become nothing but dust. His leather vest, adorned with the Hells Angels patch, symbolized a lifetime of choices that had led him to this very moment, alone and without a purpose. As the engine of his bike roared over the desolate road, a flicker of movement caught his eye. It was a small figure, barely visible from the corner of his gaze, working behind a dilapidated barn. Jake slowed, squinting to see better. It was a little girl, no older than 8 or 9, kneeling in the dirt. Her small hands were busy brushing away the soil from what appeared to be a chest, buried under years of neglect. He couldn't make out what was inside, but something about the way she moved, carefully, deliberately, pulled him closer. Jake wasn't the type to stop for anyone. He had been trained not to care, to keep moving, to avoid complications. But this time, something felt different. Maybe it was the loneliness of the open road or the strange, magnetic force of curiosity. He pulled his bike to a stop and removed his helmet. The sound of his boots crunching on the gravel broke the silence as he approached the girl. She didn't notice him at first, her attention fully consumed by the chest she was uncovering. Jake paused for a moment, watching her with an unusual sense of interest. There was something odd about the scene, something that didn't quite sit right in the pit of his stomach. "Hey," he called out softly, trying not to startle her. She froze at the sound of his voice, then slowly looked up at him. Her face, framed by strands of messy brown hair, was pale, and her eyes wide with fear. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake knelt down, trying to seem less intimidating. "I'm not here to hurt you. Just curious about what you're doing." The girl hesitated for a moment, studying him carefully, before speaking again. "I'm trying to find something important. I think it's in here." Her small fingers brushed away the last of the dirt, revealing a wooden chest, aged and worn, with intricate carvings on its surface. "My grandpa used to tell me stories about this," she continued. "He said there was a secret inside, but I think it's been hidden for a really long time." Jake's mind raced. Something about this felt wrong, but the girl's earnestness pulled him in. What could be inside this chest that was so important? And why would a little girl be digging it up all alone? His instincts, honed through years of hard living, told him this was more than just a child's game. "What kind of secret?" Jake asked, unable to hide the curiosity in his voice. The girl didn't respond immediately, her eyes darting back to the chest, as if afraid to speak the words out loud. It was then that Jake noticed something. There was a strange marking on the side of the chest, one that resembled a symbol he had seen once before, many years ago, in his own past. His heart skipped a beat. Could it be? The chest creaked as she pried it open, the sound echoing through the stillness of the barnyard. Inside, there was something that made Jake's pulse quicken, a faded photograph, old documents, and a tarnished silver medallion. As his eyes locked onto the medallion, memories flooded back, memories of a time long buried. This was no ordinary chest. This was a relic of his past, a past he had tried to forget. His hands shook slightly as he reached forward, drawn to the medallion that now lay in the palm of his hand. The girl looked up at him, her expression confused but hopeful. "What does it mean?" she asked. Jake didn't answer. His mind was racing, the weight of the moment sinking in. He had hoped to leave his past behind, but now, it seemed, it was pulling him back in. The medallion felt heavy in Jake's hand, its tarnished surface cold against his rough palm. He stared at the intricate carvings on it, his mind racing. The symbol was unmistakable, a symbol he had seen long ago, a symbol tied to the darkest days of his life, to a past he had buried deep inside. The girl, still kneeling beside the chest, looked up at him, her brown eyes wide with curiosity. She didn't understand the gravity of the situation, but Jake did. His heart was pounding in his chest, the old memories surfacing like a flood. He had tried to forget the Hell's Angels chapter he had left behind, the things he had done, the secrets he had kept. But now, holding this medallion, everything was coming back. He had no choice but to confront it. He took a deep breath and stuffed the medallion into his jacket pocket, trying to regain his composure. The girl didn't seem to notice his internal struggle. She was too focused on the other items in the chest. A photograph caught her attention. It was yellowed with age, the edges curled and frayed. She picked it up carefully and handed it to Jake. As soon as he saw it, his breath caught in his throat. It was a photo of a younger man, standing in front of a bike, a cigarette dangling from his lips. The man's eyes were intense, almost predatory, and Jake recognized him immediately. Viper Castellanos, the president of the Redwood chapter of the Hells Angels. Viper had been a legend, a man feared by everyone in the club, and Jake had known him well. Too well. The photo was a reminder of a time he wished he could erase. "Who is he?" the girl asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake hesitated. He wanted to tell her the truth, wanted to explain who Viper was, and how he had been a part of the same violent world that had consumed him for years. But something told him that wasn't a conversation for a child, especially not one as innocent as her. "He's someone I used to know," Jake said, his voice rough. "Someone from my past." The girl didn't seem satisfied with the answer, but she didn't press him further. Instead, she reached back into the chest and pulled out a set of old documents, brittle and yellowed with age. She unfolded one carefully, revealing a series of maps and handwritten notes. Jake took the paper from her, scanning the contents. The handwriting was familiar. It was Viper's. And the notes were a map leading to something buried, something hidden. A chill ran down Jake's spine. He had seen these maps before, during the days when he had been deep in the Hells Angels. They were maps to hidden caches of weapons, money, and illicit goods. But this was different. The notes mentioned something about a family secret, something more valuable than anything they had ever stolen or hidden. Jake's pulse quickened. This wasn't just about a buried treasure. It was about a secret that could destroy everything he had worked to leave behind. He folded the map carefully, his mind spinning with possibilities. "We need to go," Jake said, his voice firm. The girl looked up at him, confused. "Go? Where?" "Somewhere safe," Jake replied. "And I need you to trust me." The girl nodded slowly, her brow furrowed in uncertainty, but trusting nonetheless. Jake could see that despite her young age, she had a quiet strength. That was something he could respect. They gathered up the chest and the documents, and Jake led the way toward his bike. He was already calculating the risks in his head. The Hells Angels chapter he had left behind wasn't just going to forget about a treasure like this. If Viper's crew knew about this, they would come looking. And Jake wasn't sure if he was ready to face them again, but he didn't have a choice. The past was coming back, and this time, it wasn't going to let him go. As they rode off into the night, the wind howling around them, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The girl, sitting behind him on the bike, had no idea what she was walking into, but Jake could feel the weight of the coming storm. His past, the one he had spent so many years trying to escape, was catching up with him. And this time, there was no turning back. I'm sure the night wind howled louder. As Jake and the girl rode through the desolate countryside, their path illuminated only by the faint glow of the moon. The map, folded and tucked safely in Jake's jacket, seemed to grow heavier with each mile they covered. He had been trying to outrun his past for so long, but now, his past was catching up to him, and he had no idea what lay ahead. Every turn, every shadow on the side of the road, felt like a reminder that the life he had left behind was never truly gone. The girl, holding on tightly behind him, didn't understand the weight of the moment. To her, this was just another ride with a stranger who had become her protector. But Jake could feel the eyes of the world on him, even if no one was watching. His fingers tightened around the handlebars, the familiar grip grounding him in a world he had long since abandoned. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. Not now. Not when the stakes were so high. As they approached the small town where Jake had hoped to lay low, The air felt different, tense, almost suffocating. The buildings loomed like silent witnesses to a past he wished to forget. He hadn't been here in years. Not since he had left the Hell's Angels behind, vowing to leave the violence, the chaos, and the bloodshed behind him. But here he was again, a part of that world creeping back in. He glanced over his shoulder at the girl, who was still holding on, her wide eyes scanning the darkened streets as they passed. "We need to get inside," Jake said, his voice low and rough. "Stay close." The girl nodded, her face serious. There was no fear in her eyes, only trust. As they turned into an alley and parked behind an old, dilapidated building, Jake's instincts screamed at him to keep moving. He could feel the weight of something watching them. He didn't know who or what, but something told him they weren't alone. Jake helped the girl off the bike and motioned for her to follow him. They slipped inside the building through a back door that creaked loudly as it opened. Inside, the space was cold and smelled of rust and decay. Jake's eyes adjusted quickly to the dim light, his mind already racing through plans and contingencies. He had learned long ago that, when you made the kind of choices he had, you always had to be prepared for the worst. He led the girl to a back room and locked the door behind them. The room was empty, save for a few crates and piles of dust-covered old furniture. It wasn't much, but it was safe, for now. Jake took a seat on an old crate and began to unroll the map. The girl sat across from him, her legs crossed, looking at the paper with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. "What's this?" she asked, pointing at the markings on the map. Jake looked at the map and then back at her, his mind drifting back to the days when he had first seen it. "This is a map to a hidden cache. Something valuable." "What's so valuable about it?" she asked, her voice still steady. Jake paused, thinking about how to explain. "It's not just about money or gold. It's something more. Something that could change everything." The girl tilted her head slightly. "Like what?" Jake stood up and started pacing the room. "Like secrets. Family secrets." He stopped and looked at her. "You won't understand now, but you will soon enough." The air in the room felt thick, heavy with the weight of the moment. Jake's eyes narrowed as he stared at the map, trying to piece together the puzzle in his mind. He had no idea what this was all leading to, but one thing was clear. Whoever had left this map behind had intended for it to be found. And that meant there were others who would be looking for it. Others who wouldn't hesitate to do whatever it took to get their hands on it. Jake folded the map carefully, his fingers brushing over the edges. "We need to move fast," he said. "There's no telling how long we have before someone else comes looking." The girl stood up and walked over to him. "What's going to happen?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Jake looked down at her, his eyes softening just a little. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I'll protect you, no matter what." He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time, and saw something in her eyes, a strength that reminded him of the person he used to be, the person who believed in something greater than himself. A person who was willing to fight for what was right. Jake smiled, the first genuine smile he had allowed himself in years. "Let's get moving," he said. Together, they stepped out into the night, the map their only guide, and the past hanging over them like a storm waiting to break. As they made their way down the darkened streets, Jake could feel the weight of what was coming. He didn't know how long he could keep running from his past, but for now, he would keep the girl safe. That was all that mattered. The night was colder now, the kind of chill that sunk deep into your bones and made every movement feel like a reminder of the harsh world outside. Jake kept his eyes on the road ahead, his fingers tight around the handlebars of his Harley. The girl, still riding behind him, held on firmly, but Jake could tell she was beginning to sense the weight of what was unfolding. It wasn't just about finding some buried treasure anymore. It was about survival. The map was more than just a guide. It was a trail to something powerful, something dangerous, and Jake wasn't sure who else was chasing it. His mind kept drifting back to the Hell's Angels, to Viper, and to the old days when things had been simpler in some twisted way. Violence had been their currency. Loyalty had been their law. But those days were gone, buried like the chest they had uncovered. He had hoped to leave that life behind, but now, the past was clawing its way back into his present. They needed to keep moving. Jake could feel the tension rising in the air around them. The streets were quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that made your skin crawl. As they approached an old, run-down motel at the edge of town, Jake slowed his bike and looked around. It was a place no one would expect to find them. perfect for laying low. He parked the bike behind the motel, near the back entrance, and turned off the engine. The girl climbed off the bike, rubbing her arms against the cold. "Are we safe here?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. Jake glanced at her, trying to gauge the level of concern in her eyes. She was strong, but the weight of what they were about to face was starting to sink in. "For now," he said, though he didn't entirely believe it himself. The truth was, Jake didn't know how long they had before someone caught up with them. They hadn't even figured out what the secret was yet. All they had were old maps, a medallion, and a chest full of documents. And Viper's crew was still out there. Jake motioned for the girl to follow him into the motel, making sure to keep a low profile. The fluorescent lights inside flickered as they stepped into the dim lobby. The man behind the counter barely looked up from his newspaper. "One room," Jake said, his voice gruff. The clerk nodded, scribbling something on a piece of paper. "That'll be $50, he muttered. Jake handed him the cash without a second thought, and they headed up to the room. It wasn't much, just a bed, a small dresser, and a bathroom with a cracked mirror. But it would do for the night. Once inside, Jake locked the door and pulled the shades down on the window. He looked at the girl, who was now sitting on the edge of the bed, her small hands twisting nervously. "I know you're scared," he said, his voice softer than before. "But you have to trust me. We'll figure this out." The girl nodded, though her eyes were filled with uncertainty. "What happens next?" she asked. Jake took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had no answers, but he wasn't about to let her see that. "We wait. We go through the documents and figure out what we're dealing with. But we stay quiet. Keep a low profile. Don't let anyone know we're here." The girl didn't respond right away. Instead, she stood up and walked over to the small table near the window, where the chest and map had been placed. She picked up the map again, her fingers tracing the markings carefully. "Do you think this will lead us to something big?" she asked, her voice thoughtful. Jake looked at the map, his mind racing. "I don't know," he admitted. "But whatever it is, it's something people are willing to kill for. And that's why we have to be careful." The girl looked up at him, her eyes narrowing as she studied his face. "You're not telling me everything, are you?" she asked. Jake felt the weight of her gaze, but he didn't flinch. He couldn't tell her everything. Some truths were too dangerous. "There are things in my past that I can't explain right now," he said slowly. "But I'll protect you. You just need to keep your head down and trust me." She nodded again, though Jake could tell she was still processing it all. He could see the questions swirling in her mind, but she didn't ask anymore. She seemed to understand that now wasn't the time. They sat in silence for a while, the tension hanging thick in the air. Jake could hear the sound of distant sirens, a constant reminder that the world outside was still moving, still unaware of the storm brewing in the shadows. Eventually, Jake stood up and walked over to the small dresser, where he found a dusty old phone book. He flipped through it, looking for a contact he had been meaning to reach for days, someone who could help them navigate the mess they had walked into. As his finger traced the name on the page, a sudden knock at the door froze him in his tracks. His heart raced. It wasn't the clerk. This was something else. "Stay behind me," Jake ordered, his voice low. The girl nodded, her eyes wide with fear. Jake reached for the door, taking one last look at her before he opened it. But what he found on the other side wasn't what he expected. Standing there was a man, tall and imposing, wearing a leather jacket with a patch Jake knew all too well. It was a Hell's Angels patch. The man's eyes met Jake's, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. "Jake Morrison?" the man asked, his voice deep and steady. Jake's pulse quickened, but he didn't show it. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The man at the door didn't move, his eyes locked on Jake as though waiting for him to react. Jake's heart raced in his chest. He'd known this moment might come, but he hadn't expected it to come so soon. The man standing there, wearing the Hell's Angels patch, wasn't just some old member. He was someone Jake had hoped to never see again. "Jake Morrison?" the man repeated, his voice deep, rough, like he'd been smoking for decades. Jake didn't answer right away. His mind was spinning, trying to process what this meant. He had left the Hell's Angels for a reason that was tied to the darkest part of his past. This man, however, wasn't giving him a choice. "Yeah, that's me," Jake finally said, his voice steady, though his mind was anything but. "What do you want?" The man outside stepped closer, not threatening, but not backing off either. He looked at Jake with a mixture of recognition and cold detachment. "I'm not here for a reunion, Morrison," the man said, glancing past Jake into the room behind him. The girl, who had been sitting quietly on the bed, stood up at the sound of his voice, her wide eyes filled with fear. Jake's hand instinctively went to his jacket pocket, where he had stashed the map and the medallion. "You're not here for a reunion," Jake echoed. "Then what are you here for?" The man's eyes flicked toward the girl before returning to Jake. "I'm here because you're in something deep, and you don't even know how deep." Jake felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. This wasn't just about the treasure anymore. It was about something far bigger. The girl was still standing behind him, silent, though Jake could tell she was terrified. "I'm not interested in whatever you're selling," Jake said, his voice firm, but not as certain as he wanted to sound. The man didn't smile, but there was something almost amused in his eyes. "You don't have a choice," he said. "You're already involved. All I'm offering is a way out. The only question is, do you want it?" Jake didn't speak for a moment. His mind was racing. The past had caught up with him faster than he had thought possible. He'd thought he could walk away, start fresh, protect the girl, and find a way to bury the past for good. But it was clear now that the Hells Angels had no intention of letting him go. "What's your game here?" Jake asked, keeping his voice steady. The man outside shifted slightly, as though the weight of Jake's words had hit him. "You think it's all about the treasure, don't you?" The man's voice dropped to a whisper. "That treasure is a key. And it's not just your past that's at stake, Morrison. It's everyone's. You don't even know what you're holding. But we do. And we're not the only ones." Jake felt a chill run through him. He had known it was dangerous. He had known the treasure wasn't just gold or jewels, but this? He had no idea what he had gotten himself tangled up in. The man outside took a step back, giving Jake a long look. "I'll be here if you change your mind," he said, before turning and walking down the hallway without another word. Jake didn't move, standing in the doorway, watching the man leave. When the sound of footsteps had faded, Jake closed the door and turned back to the girl. Her eyes were wide with fear. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake didn't have a good answer. "Someone from my past," he said quietly, his eyes not meeting hers. He didn't want her to see the fear that was starting to settle in his gut. He couldn't afford to show weakness now, not when they were already so close to the edge. "We need to go," he said, snapping himself back into focus. "Stay close. We're not safe here anymore." The girl nodded, her expression grim but understanding. She had come to trust Jake, and in this moment, she didn't question him. They packed up what little they had, moving quickly, silently. Jake knew they couldn't stay in the motel. The man's warning echoed in his mind. Whoever else was after the treasure, whatever this was about, they weren't going to stop. They would keep coming. And now, so was Jake. The road ahead was dark and uncertain, but Jake had no choice. He had to keep moving forward. For his own sake. For the girls. And maybe, just maybe, for the people he had left behind long ago. The night seemed darker than before, the air colder, carrying with it the weight of uncertainty. Jake didn't know what had just happened, but he knew one thing. They were no longer safe. His fingers tightened around the handlebars as he revved the engine of his Harley, the sound of the powerful machine cutting through the stillness of the night. The girl, still riding behind him, kept her arms around his waist, but Jake could feel the tension in her body. She could sense it too. Something had shifted. As they sped down the road, the distance between them and the motel seemed to grow, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. The man at the door had left, but his presence lingered. The warning in his words echoed in Jake's mind. It's not just your past that's at stake. It's everyone's. Jake didn't understand it all, but he knew enough. The treasure they had uncovered, the map, the medallion, these weren't just objects of value. They were part of something bigger, something far more dangerous. And whoever was after them wouldn't stop until they had it all. The girl, sensing the shift in Jake's demeanor, spoke up from behind him. "Where are we going?" Her voice was soft, but filled with the weight of the question. Jake didn't answer right away. He could feel her curiosity pressing against him, but he wasn't sure what to say. How could he explain to her that they were about to dive headfirst into a world that could destroy them both? "We're going to keep moving," he said finally, his voice steady but strained. "We need to figure out what this all means. And then we'll know what to do next." The girl didn't respond, but Jake could feel her understanding. She didn't need to know everything. She just needed to trust him. For now, That would have to be enough. They continued down the road, the headlights illuminating the dark path ahead. The world outside felt like a blur, a series of twisted images flashing by as Jake's mind raced. He thought about the Hells Angels, about Viper, about everything that had happened before. But most of all, he thought about the girl. She had no idea what she had gotten involved in, and he couldn't help but feel responsible for dragging her into it. She was just a kid. She shouldn't have to be involved in any of this. But now, there was no turning back. They were in this together, whether they liked it or not. As the miles stretched on, Jake kept his focus on the road ahead, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the treasure, to the medallion, to Viper's crew. What did they want with it? And why was it so important? The answers seemed just out of reach, like a puzzle missing its final piece. The questions weighed on him, but he knew they would have to wait. They needed to find shelter, a place, to think. He wasn't sure how long they could keep running, but for now, they had to stay ahead of whoever was looking for them. As they reached the outskirts of the town, Jake spotted an old, abandoned diner up ahead. The neon lights flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow over the empty parking lot. It was the perfect place to lay low. He slowed the bike and pulled into the lot, coming to a stop near the diner's front door. The place looked as if it had been abandoned for years. Windows cracked, paint peeling, the faint smell of mildew in the air. But it was exactly what they needed. "We'll stay here for the night," Jake said, turning off the engine. The girl slid off the bike, her face still filled with uncertainty. She had been quiet for most of the ride, but Jake could tell she was thinking. "Is this safe?" she asked, her voice tentative. Jake didn't have the answer. "It'll have to be," he replied, his voice firm but tired. "We need a place to rest and figure out what's next." They walked toward the diner, the silence between them heavy. Jake pushed open the door, the hinges creaking in protest, and they stepped inside. The air was stale, the floor covered in dust. It was the perfect hiding spot, isolated and forgotten. Jake scanned the room quickly, making sure there were no surprises. It seemed safe enough. He gestured for the girl to sit at one of the booths. "Stay here," he said, his voice low. "I'll check the place out." She nodded, her eyes still wide with uncertainty, but trusting him nonetheless. Jake moved cautiously through the diner, checking the back rooms, making sure no one had followed them. It didn't take long to determine the place was empty. No sign of anyone, no signs of trouble, at least for now. When he returned to the booth, the girl was looking at the map again, her fingers tracing the markings with curiosity. "What does it all mean?" she asked, her voice soft but insistent. Jake took a deep breath, his eyes lingering on the map. "I don't know," he admitted. "But we're going to find out. We have to." He sat down across from her, his mind already working through the next steps. They couldn't stay in this town forever. They needed to keep moving, too. Stay ahead of whatever was coming. But for now, they had to rest, regroup, and prepare for whatever came next. Jake glanced at the girl, watching her with a mixture of guilt and determination. She was just a kid, but she was tougher than most adults he'd met. And she was in this now, just like him. They were stuck together in this mess, whether they liked it or not. He didn't know how it would end, but one thing was certain. There was no going back. The air was thick with tension as Jake and the girl sat in the old diner, their eyes scanning the map laid out before them. The flickering neon outside cast an eerie glow through the dusty windows, making the whole place feel like a relic from the past. Jake had always known there were risks in his line of life, but he never imagined the past would come back with such force. The girl was quieter now, still processing everything that had happened in the past few hours. Jake could see it in her eyes. She was trying to make sense of it all, just like him. "What do you think the treasure is?" she asked, breaking the silence. Jake didn't immediately answer. He had no idea. The treasure, the map, the chest, it all seemed to point to something far bigger than he had expected. The girl was right to ask. She needed to understand, but part of him didn't want to tell her everything. He couldn't protect her from this world forever, but he could shield her from some of the harsh truths. "I don't know," Jake said finally, his voice calm. "But it's more than just gold. There's something deeper, something connected to the past, and I don't think it's something we can just walk away from." The girl's eyes narrowed, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean by that?" Jake hesitated, thinking back to the warning the man had given him earlier. Whoever was behind this, whoever had hidden the treasure, wasn't just after money. There was something else at play here, something that could change everything. "I mean," Jake said, his voice growing more serious. "There are people out there who would do anything to get their hands on this. People who've been after it for a long time." He paused for a moment, collecting his thoughts. "And I'm not the only one who knows about it." The girl looked at him, her expression a mix of fear and determination. She didn't ask any more questions, but Jake could tell she understood. They were in this together now. He couldn't keep her in the dark, but he also couldn't let her get caught up in something she wasn't ready for. They both sat in silence, the weight of their situation settling in. Jake could feel the familiar tension building inside him. The calm before the storm. They had been lucky so far, but luck could only carry them so far. "We need to move," Jake said, breaking the silence. "We can't stay here too long. We don't know who's looking for us." The girl nodded, not needing any more explanation. They quickly gathered their things, Jake keeping the map and medallion close to him. The night outside seemed darker now, the quiet unnerving. As they stepped out of the diner, Jake felt the familiar prickle of danger along his spine. He didn't know where they were going next, but he knew they couldn't stay on the move forever. They needed a plan. "Where do we go from here?" the girl asked as they walked toward the bike. Jake paused for a moment, considering. The road stretched ahead, an endless line leading into the unknown. "We find someone who can help us," he said finally. "Someone who knows what we're dealing with." He didn't elaborate, but the girl didn't press him for more. She had already seen too much. "You think someone can help us?" she asked instead, her voice filled with doubt. Jake didn't answer immediately. He wasn't sure if anyone could help them, but there was one person he knew he could trust. At least, he hoped he could. "I know a guy," Jake said, his voice low. "He's connected. He might know more about this than anyone else." The girl didn't seem convinced, but she didn't argue. They both knew they were running out of options. They reached the bike, and Jake started the engine. The roar of the Harley seemed to cut through the tension in the air, but it didn't do much to calm Jake's nerves. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As they rode through the night, the weight of their situation became heavier with each passing mile. Jake didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. They couldn't keep running. They needed answers, and they needed them fast. The road stretched on, empty and dark, but Jake's mind was focused on the next step. They had to find the person who could help them. And when they did, everything would change. For better or worse, they were about to face the consequences of the past. And Jake knew, deep down, that he couldn't do this alone. The night felt heavier now, and the road stretched endlessly before them. Jake's mind raced as he rode through the quiet streets, his thoughts still on the man at the motel and the cryptic warning he had received. He knew he was running out of time. Every second that ticked by made it more likely that someone dangerous, was already on their trail. The girl, riding behind him, clung to him silently, sensing the tension in the air but not fully understanding the danger. Jake wished he could shield her from all of it. She had only gotten involved by chance, and yet, she was now tied to a story that could ruin them both. He could feel her small hands gripping him tightly, and despite the fear that was beginning to creep into his chest, he felt a strange comfort knowing she was there. He wasn't sure how much longer they could keep running. The road was dark and empty, just like the life he had tried to leave behind. He had thought he could escape it, that the Hells Angels and their dangerous game would be a distant memory, but he was wrong. Whatever secret they had uncovered, it wasn't just valuable. It was a key to something far bigger than either of them. They had no idea what they were really dealing with. "We'll stop at the next town," Jake said, his voice steady but filled with an urgency he couldn't hide. "We need to find some answers." The girl didn't respond, but Jake felt her nodding behind him. She trusted him, at least for now. He needed to make sure he could keep her safe, but that was becoming harder by the minute. They reached a small, isolated town a few miles down the road. The place looked like something out of a ghost story. Empty streets, flickering streetlights, and a feeling of abandonment that sent a chill down Jake's spine. He wasn't sure why he had chosen this town, but something in the back of his mind told him it was where they needed to be. As they pulled into a rundown parking lot near a diner that looked like it had been closed for years, Jake parked the bike and turned off the engine. He quickly glanced around, scanning the area for any signs of trouble. The silence of the town was unsettling, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "Stay close," Jake said quietly, helping the girl off the bike. "We're not staying here long. Just need to talk to someone." The girl, now more alert than before, nodded and followed him. They approached the diner cautiously, the doors hanging loosely on their hinges. Jake pushed them open, and they stepped inside. The smell of stale coffee and old grease hit them immediately. The diner was deserted, but the atmosphere was far from peaceful. It felt like they had just walked into a trap. Jake's eyes darted around, searching for anything out of place. And then he saw it, a figure sitting in the far corner, hidden in the shadows. The man was dressed in all black, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. He wasn't a local. Jake could tell that right away. His gut instinct was to turn and leave, but the man's eyes locked onto him with a knowing look, as if he had been expecting them. "Jake Morrison," the man said, his voice low and calm. "I've been waiting for you." Jake's heart skipped a beat. How did this man know his name? "Who are you?" Jake asked, his voice steady but cautious. The man smiled slightly, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "Someone who knows about the treasure you've found," he replied. "And someone who can help you figure out what to do with it." Jake didn't trust him. Not yet. But the man had hit a nerve. How did he know about the treasure? He couldn't be another member of the Hells Angels. Jake had kept his past hidden for too long. "What do you want?" Jake demanded, his hand subconsciously moving toward the pocket where he had stashed the medallion. "I want the same thing you do," the man said, his tone growing more serious. "I want to find out what's inside that treasure before someone else does." Jake narrowed his eyes. "And what makes you think I'll trust you?" The man leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Because, Jake, I'm the one who can give you the answers. The treasure you found isn't just valuable. It's the key to a much bigger picture, and there are people out there who'll stop at nothing to get it." Jake felt a chill creep up his spine. He had known the treasure was dangerous, but this? He wasn't ready for this. The man in front of him wasn't just another biker. He was someone who knew too much. "Who's after it?" Jake asked, his voice tight. The man didn't hesitate. "The same people who've been pulling the strings for years," he said. "The people who control everything. You've just stepped into a game far bigger than you realize." Jake's mind raced. This wasn't just about the Hells Angels anymore. There were forces at play here that Jake couldn't even begin to understand. And if he didn't get answers soon, he and the girl were going to be caught in the middle of something much worse than they could imagine. "You need to decide, Jake," the man said, his voice low and urgent. "Do you want to keep running, or do you want to find the truth?" Jake hesitated. He had been running his whole life, and now, it seemed there was nowhere left to hide. "What's the next step?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. The man smiled again, the glint in his eyes telling Jake everything he needed to know. "The next step is to trust me, and together, we'll find out what this treasure really means." The girl, standing quietly beside Jake, looked up at him, her eyes filled with both fear and determination. She didn't understand the full extent of what was going on, but she knew one thing. Whatever happened next, she was in this with him. Jake took a deep breath. There was no turning back now. The man across from Jake leaned back in his chair, his hands steepled in front of him, eyes never leaving Jake's face. Jake felt the weight of the situation press down on him, but he didn't flinch. The girl stood quietly by the window, her small figure tense as she looked out at the empty street. She didn't understand all of what was happening, but she felt the danger in the air, the way it hummed just beneath the surface. "You're not telling me everything," Jake said, his voice low, steady. The man smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. "You're right," he said, leaning forward slightly. "I'm not, but you'll learn everything soon enough." Jake's hand went to his jacket pocket, feeling the map and the medallion nestled inside. The last few days had been a whirlwind, and he could feel the storm brewing on the horizon. This wasn't just about some buried treasure anymore. It was about something bigger, something dangerous. "Who are these people?" Jake asked, his eyes narrowing. "Who's behind all of this?" The man didn't hesitate. "They're a network of power," he said, his voice cold. "The kind of power that pulls the strings behind the scenes. Government officials, businessmen, the wealthy elite, people who control everything. And you've just stumbled into their world." Jake's mind raced. He had never been a part of something so vast. The Hells Angels had always been about loyalty, violence, and survival. But this was something else. "Why me?" Jake asked, the question hanging heavy between them. "Why was I the one who found this? And why the hell does it matter so much?" The man leaned in, his gaze sharp. "Because, Jake, you're connected. The treasure, the map, the medallion, it's all linked to your past. To something you thought was gone. Jake's heart skipped a beat. The past. It always came back to the past. What do you mean, linked to my past? He asked, trying to keep the edge out of his voice. The man's eyes softened, just for a moment. Your family, he said, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. Jake froze. He had never spoken about his family, never allowed himself to remember the things he had tried to leave behind. What are you talking about? He demanded. My family's dead. Gone. There's nothing left. The man's gaze never wavered. That's what you think, he said. But there's something you don't know. Something that's been hidden for years. And you're the key to unlocking it. Jake felt his stomach twist. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being drawn into something that would break him, something that had been set in motion long before he ever stepped foot in that motel. The man stood up and walked toward the door. Come with me, he said, his voice quieter now. We need to go see someone. Someone who can tell you the truth. Jake hesitated. He wanted to refuse, to walk away and take the girl with him. But something in the man's words, something in his eyes, told him that this was the only way. Let's go, Jake said finally. He turned to the girl, who was still standing by the window, her eyes wide with fear. Stay close, he said, his voice softer. We're not done yet. The girl nodded, but Jake could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She wasn't just scared of the situation. She was scared for him. They walked out of the diner, the man leading the way. Jake's hand stayed close to his jacket pocket, his fingers brushing the edges of the map. As they stepped out into the night, the quiet hum of the town felt oppressive, like something was about to snap. They reached an old car parked in the lot, and the man motioned for them to get in. Jake hesitated, his gaze flicking between the man and the car. There was no turning back now. He opened the door and slid into the back seat, the girl following closely behind him. The man got into the driver's seat and started the engine. The car pulled out of the lot, and they drove in silence, the city lights fading behind them. Jake's mind raced, but he kept his thoughts focused. The only thing that mattered now was finding out the truth. About the treasure. About his past. About the people who were hunting them. As they drove, the man finally spoke again. There's a place we need to go, he said. A place where you can find the answers you've been looking for. Jake glanced at him in the rearview mirror. Where? He asked. The man's eyes met his in the mirror. You'll know when we get there, he said cryptically. But be ready, Jake. Because what you learn might change everything. The words hung in the air like a warning, and Jake felt a cold chill run down his spine. He had no idea what was coming, but he knew it wasn't going to be easy. Whatever truth lay ahead, it was going to tear open everything he had tried to bury. And there was no way to escape it now. Not for him. Not for the girl. The road ahead stretched out before them, dark and unknown. But one thing was certain, they couldn't run anymore. They had to face whatever came next. The car's tires hummed against the road, a steady rhythm that did little to calm Jake's nerves. He sat in the back seat, the girl beside him, her eyes fixed on the window as the dark world outside blurred past. The man, who had led them this far, kept his hands steady on the wheel, his face expressionless, as though he was already prepared for whatever was coming next. Jake wasn't sure if that was reassuring or terrifying. Every minute that passed brought them closer to something unknown. The map, tucked in his jacket, felt heavier with each mile. He had never intended to be pulled back into this world, the world of power, secrets, and dangerous people. He had walked away once, but now, it seemed, there was no way out. They had come too far, uncovered too much. The girl shifted beside him, her small form a reminder of what was at stake. He had to protect her. That was the only thing that mattered now. How much further? Jake finally asked, breaking the silence. The man's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror before returning to the road. We're close, he said, his voice clipped. But be ready. This place, it's not like anything you've seen before. Jake didn't ask any more questions. He wasn't sure he wanted to know the answers. He just needed to know what came next. The car continued to roll through the quiet streets, the city lights fading as they approached the outskirts. The landscape became more barren, the buildings fewer and farther apart. The tension in the car thickened. Jake could feel it now, a sense of impending danger hanging in the air like a storm cloud. The girl shifted again, sensing the change in the atmosphere. Where are we going? She asked, her voice small but filled with curiosity. Jake glanced down at her, forcing a smile. It's a safe place, he said, trying to reassure her, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. She didn't respond. but Jake could see the doubt in her eyes. They had been running for so long, always moving, never settling. Now, they were heading toward something unknown, something that could change everything. The car turned down a narrow, winding road, the headlights cutting through the darkness ahead. Jake could barely make out the shape of an old building in the distance, its outline barely visible against the night sky. As they got closer, Jake could see the building more clearly, an old, abandoned warehouse, its windows dark and boarded up. The man turned the car into the overgrown parking lot and came to a stop in front of a set of rusted metal doors. "We're here," he said, his voice steady, though Jake could hear the underlying tension. The girl didn't speak, but Jake could feel her fear. He couldn't blame her. He was scared too. This was it. This was the moment when everything they had uncovered would come crashing down on them. The man opened the car door and stepped out, gesturing for Jake and the girl to follow. Jake hesitated for a moment, then nodded to the girl. "Stay close," he said softly. The two of them got out of the car, the cold air biting at their skin. The man led them to the warehouse doors, his footsteps echoing in the quiet night. As they stepped inside, Jake's eyes adjusted to the dim light. The inside of the warehouse was vast, empty, and eerily silent. The only sound was the distant hum of machinery, long forgotten, but still running somewhere deep within the building. The man led them through the maze of steel beams and old crates, his steps confident and sure. Jake kept his eyes on him, watching his every move. "What is this place?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer immediately. He stopped in front of a large metal door at the back of the warehouse and turned to face them. "This is where the truth lies," he said, his voice low. "Everything you've been searching for is behind that door." Jake felt a lump form in his throat. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't ready to confront the truth, whatever it was. But he knew he had no choice. He had come this far. "What's behind it?" Jake asked, his voice tight. The man's eyes softened, almost as if he understood the fear in Jake's voice. "It's time you found out." With a click, the man unlocked the door and pushed it open. The sound of the hinges creaked, echoing in the vast, empty space. Inside was a room unlike anything Jake had ever seen. The walls were lined with old documents, maps, and photographs, each piece carefully organized as if someone had been watching, waiting for this moment. At the center of the room was a large, wooden table, and on it lay the final piece of the puzzle. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped forward, the girl standing quietly beside him. The man walked toward the table and gestured for them to come closer. "This is what they've been after," he said, his voice grim. "And now it's yours." On the table lay a thick, leather-bound book, its cover worn and aged. The edges were frayed, as if it had been handled by many hands over the years. The man opened it slowly, revealing page after page of cryptic symbols and drawings. Jake could barely make sense of it. But the one thing he could understand was the name at the top of the first page, Morrison. His heart skipped a beat. This was personal. This wasn't just about the treasure anymore. This was about him. "This is your legacy," the man said, his eyes locked on Jake's. "Your family's legacy. And it's more powerful than you ever imagined." Jake stood there, stunned, his mind racing. He had no idea what was coming next, but one thing was clear. His past had come back to claim him. And there was no way out. Jake stared down at the book on the table, his heart racing as the weight of the moment settled on him. The man's words echoed in his mind. "This is your legacy. Your family's legacy." His hands trembled slightly as he reached out to touch the leather cover, the rough texture of it sending a chill through his fingertips. The girl, standing beside him, watched quietly, her eyes wide with confusion and curiosity. She had no idea what this book meant, what it represented, but Jake could feel that everything in this room was about to change. Slowly, he opened the book, the creaking sound of the pages turning filling the otherwise silent room. The first page was filled with cryptic symbols and ancient writing that looked like something from another time. Jake's eyes scanned the pages, but the words didn't make sense to him. He had no idea what he was looking at, but he knew that the book was important. "What is this?" Jake asked, his voice tight with uncertainty. The man who had brought them here stepped forward, his expression somber. "It's the key to everything, Morrison," he said. "This book holds the answers you've been searching for. It's a record of your family's involvement in something much bigger than any of you realized." Jake felt a knot form in his stomach. Family. He had spent so many years trying to distance himself from that word, trying to leave behind the memories of a past that had consumed him. But now, everything was coming full circle. My family, Jake echoed, his voice almost a whisper. The man nodded. Your family has been connected to a powerful group for generations. They were part of a secret society, a network that controlled much more than anyone could imagine. And now, it's your turn to take your place. Jake's mind spun with the revelation. A secret society? His family, involved in something like that? He had never known. His father had always been distant, cold, but he never spoke of anything like this. I don't believe you, Jake said, shaking his head. I never heard anything about this. The man sighed, his gaze unwavering. Of course you didn't. The society has operated in the shadows for centuries, carefully hidden from the public eye. But your family, Jake, they were central to it. Your name, your bloodline, it's tied to this. Jake felt a rush of emotions, confusion, anger, disbelief. How could this be real? His life had been nothing but a string of bad decisions, violence, and betrayal. How could he possibly be part of something so vast? I don't want any part of this, Jake said firmly, standing up and turning away from the table. The girl, still silent, looked up at him with concern. Jake? She asked softly. Jake ignored her for a moment, trying to gather his thoughts. He had been running from his past for so long, and now it seemed there was no escaping it. The man took a step closer, his voice low but firm. You don't have a choice, Morrison. You're already involved. The book, the treasure, it's all part of your destiny. It's time to face the truth. Jake clenched his fists, his mind racing. His life, his decisions, had never felt more out of his control. But now, it seemed like he was being pulled into something far bigger than he could handle. I don't want this responsibility, Jake muttered, his voice filled with frustration. I never asked for any of this. The man didn't seem to care about Jake's resistance. It's not about what you want, he said coldly. It's about what's been set in motion long before you were born. You can either accept it and move forward, or you can run and risk losing everything, including the girl. The girl's eyes widened at the mention of her, and Jake felt a surge of protectiveness rush through him. He turned back to the man, his jaw clenched. What does she have to do with this? The man's gaze flickered to the girl before looking back at Jake. Her involvement was never planned, but it doesn't change anything. She's part of this now, whether you like it or not. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had brought her into this. He had exposed her to a world of danger, a world of secrets and lies. And now, there was no turning back. I'll protect her, Jake said through gritted teeth. But don't think for a second I'm doing this because of your so-called legacy. I'm doing it because I have no other choice. The man's lips curled into a faint smile, but it was laced with something darker. That's the spirit. But understand this, Morrison, the path you're on is dangerous. There are forces at play here that you can't even begin to comprehend. And you're not just running from the past anymore. You're running from the people who control everything. Jake stared at the man, trying to make sense of what he was saying. He had never imagined something so big, so twisted. But there was no denying it now. His past, his family, and the secrets they held were far from over. So what's the next step? Jake asked, his voice tired but resolute. The man stepped back, his eyes narrowing as he took a deep breath. You need to decide, Jake. You need to decide if you're going to take your place in this world, or if you're going to let it destroy you. But either way, there's no going back. The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. There was no escaping this. He had been dragged into a game he didn't understand, and now he had to play. For better or worse, his life was no longer his own. He glanced at the girl, who was standing silently by the table, her face full of confusion. We'll figure it out, he said quietly, though he wasn't sure he believed it. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next, he wasn't going to let them take her from him. Not without a fight. The man's words hung in the air like a weight Jake couldn't shake off. There's no going back. The phrase echoed in his mind, over and over again. Jake stared at the book on the table, his fingers still tracing the edges of the pages as if trying to find some clue, some escape. The girl, standing silently beside him, hadn't said a word since they had entered this room. Her eyes, wide with confusion and fear, flickered between Jake and the strange man who had led them here. Jake's pulse raced. The past, the legacy, his family, it was all becoming more complicated by the second. Everything he thought he knew about his life, about who he was being torn apart, piece by piece. He had spent years running from this, trying to forget the connections that tied him to the Hells Angels, to a world of violence, secrecy, and power. But now, it was clear that the past had come knocking, and there was no escaping it. "What do you want from me?" Jake's voice was low, rough, as he finally asked the question that had been building up inside him since he first learned about his family's involvement in this twisted legacy. The man across the table studied him for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. "You don't get to choose, Jake. You're already a part of this." His voice was calm, but Jake could hear the underlying tension. "Your family was part of something far bigger than you've ever realized. And now, it's your turn to take their place." The words hit Jake like a punch. His heart pounded in his chest. He had always believed that his family was nothing but a distant memory, a part of his past that he could leave behind. But now, it was clear that the past was more alive than ever, and it was pulling him back into a world he wanted no part of. He glanced at the girl. Her innocent face was filled with questions, but she was wise enough to stay silent for now, to trust that Jake would somehow protect her from whatever came next. Jake took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "What am I supposed to do now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man's lips curled into a small smile, but there was no warmth in it. "What you were born to do," he said, his eyes narrowing. "You have the answers in your blood. Your family's legacy has been waiting for you." Jake wanted to scream, to run, to tell the man to shut up and leave him alone. But deep down, he knew the truth. The man wasn't lying. Everything, the treasure, the book, the map, it was all connected to him. Whether he liked it or not, Jake was now part of something far bigger than he could ever imagine. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to clear his mind. "What do I need to do?" he asked, his voice strained. The man's eyes softened, but the coldness never left his tone. "You need to follow the path. There are people who have been watching you, waiting for you to come to your senses. You've already got what they want, but if you don't act quickly, they'll come for you, and they won't stop until they get what they need." The girl looked up at Jake, her face filled with fear. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice small. Jake's heart ached as he looked at her. He had tried to protect her from all of this, but now, it seemed there was no escaping it. "It means we're not alone," Jake said, his voice tight. "And we're not safe." He turned back to the man, who was now standing beside the table, his arms crossed. "What do you want from me?" Jake repeated, his patience running thin. The man stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Jake's. "You have to decide, Jake. Will you take your place, or will you run from it like your father did?" Jake flinched at the mention of his father. His relationship with his father had always been strained, a dark part of his past that Jake had tried to forget. "I'm nothing like him," Jake muttered under his breath. The man didn't respond. Instead, he turned to the girl. "You've been dragged into this against your will, haven't you?" The girl didn't answer, but Jake could see the look in her eyes. She was scared, but she wasn't backing down. "We'll leave," Jake said, his voice filled with determination. "We'll get out of here. We don't need to be a part of this." The man's expression didn't change, but his gaze grew colder. "You can try to run," he said, his voice low, "but they won't let you. And they won't stop. You think you can just walk away from this? You think you can outrun a legacy that's been chasing you your whole life?" Jake's fists clenched, his mind racing. He knew what the man was saying was true. There was no running. The past had already caught up with him, and now he had to face it. "What's next?" Jake asked, his voice steady. The man smiled, a cold, knowing smile. "Next, you do what you were meant to do." The room fell silent as Jake took a step back, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't sure he would ever be ready. But the truth was clear now. There was no turning back. His family's legacy was his to claim, for better or worse. And no matter how hard he tried to fight it, he had already stepped into a world that would never let him go. The room felt heavy, the silence hanging thick in the air as Jake stood there, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had come this far, but now, staring at the book and the man before him, he knew there was no easy way out. The girl beside him was still, her small hands tightly clutching her coat, as if she could shield herself from the storm that was closing in on them. Jake could feel her fear, and it mirrored his own. There were no more choices, no more roads to run down. Everything that had brought him here was leading to this moment, this reckoning. The man, whose cold eyes never left Jake's face, seemed to sense Jake's hesitation. "You're already in it, Jake. There's no turning back." The words were calm, but filled with an unmistakable finality. Jake knew the truth in them. His past had caught up with him, whether he wanted it to or not. The legacy he had tried so hard to escape was now standing right in front of him. And the girl, she had been dragged into this with him. He couldn't leave her. He couldn't let her go through this alone. "So what now?" Jake asked, his voice quieter than before, but his resolve stronger. The man took a slow step forward, the faintest trace of a smile on his lips, but there was nothing reassuring about it. "Now, you follow the path. The legacy that's been waiting for you. You step up, or you run. But running only gets you so far." Jake felt his chest tighten as the words sank in. The path. His family's path. He had always believed that the choices he made had defined who he was. But now, it seemed like he was nothing more than a pawn in someone else's game. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop running. The world wasn't going to wait for him to catch up. The man moved towards the table and pulled out a drawer hidden underneath the heavy wood. He retrieved a small black box and placed it in front of Jake. "This," he said, "is the final piece. The key to your family's legacy." Jake's heart beat faster. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached for the box. It was cold to the touch, the metal smooth and unmarked, as if it had been waiting for him to take it. He opened the box slowly, his eyes widening as he saw what lay inside. A small, ornate key, golden and intricate, with markings that seemed to pulse with an ancient energy. "This is it," the man said, his voice now colder than ever. "With this, you unlock the final chapter. But be warned, Jake. The people who are after you aren't just trying to stop you. They want to erase everything. They'll do whatever it takes to take this from you." Jake didn't respond. He was still holding the key, the weight of it in his hand feeling almost like a promise. One that had been passed down through generations, sealed away until now. The girl stepped closer, her gaze fixed on the key. "What does it do?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with a quiet intensity. Jake glanced at her, his heart heavy. "I don't know," he said, his voice hoarse. "But I'm going to find out. For both of us." The man watched them both, his face unreadable. "You've made your choice, Jake. Now you have to live with it." Jake closed the box and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He felt the weight of the key against his chest, a constant reminder of what lay ahead. He couldn't run from it anymore. The legacy, the treasure, the people hunting them, it was all part of his story now. And if he wanted to protect the girl, he had to face it head on. He turned to the man. "I'm done running," Jake said, his voice steady. "What's the next step?" The man's eyes flickered with something, satisfaction, maybe, but it was gone in an instant. "The next step is to go to the place where it all began. The place where your family's ties to this secret society were formed. It's time to unlock the past, Jake. And once you do, you'll understand what you're really up against." Jake nodded, his resolve hardening. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. He turned to the girl, who was still watching him. Her eyes were filled with uncertainty, but also trust. She didn't understand everything, but she was willing to follow him. "We're going to get through this," Jake promised her, his voice firm. The girl nodded, her lips trembling slightly as she took a deep breath. "I believe you," she said, her voice small but filled with determination. Jake's heart swelled with a mix of pride and guilt. He had dragged her into this, but he couldn't let her go through it alone. They were in this together, no matter what came next. The man motioned for them to follow him. "It's time," he said, his voice low and cold. "Let's finish this." Jake took one last look around the room, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was it, the end of the road. But it was also the beginning of something new, something he had no control over, but something he had to see through to the end. As they walked toward the door, Jake's mind raced, but there was no more running. The past had caught up with him, and now the only way out was through. Whatever came next, Jake was ready, and he wasn't going to let anyone take the girl away from him. Not now. Not ever.